about Sarah. She has a bachelor in chemistry and biology and a PhD in virology from Penn State University. She also has been an instructor for the empowerment program since cohort 1.0. So Sarah, welcome to the DS4A Colombia program. It's an honor to have you with us.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. I have heard such wonderful things about this program, and this is my first time interacting with all of you. So I'm really excited for that. I heard such great things. I heard that Scott taught recently and heard such wonderful things about all of you. So I'm really excited for today. So yeah, thank you, Monica. We are going to talk today about exploratory data analysis. So let's get started. Let me share my screen and we can jump into today's case. So let me know, I will keep an eye on the live chat. So let me know about pace, if we're going too fast or too slow, or if I'm talking too fast or too slow. And if there's anything that you are confused about, or if at some point you can't see my screen, if anything happens, just send a message in the live chat and I'll keep an eye on it. So hopefully if you haven't opened your case yet, go ahead and open this so you can follow along for our first case today, which is going to be on spatial and temporal trends in crop production. So this case is going to be purely analytical. We're not necessarily going to discuss any code or anything for this case. This is going to be thinking about the concept of exploratory data analysis, usually referred to as EDA. Okay, so let's first talk about our main goals for this case and kind of a quick introduction. So exploratory data analysis, in my opinion, is one of the most difficult parts of and the whole process of analyzing your data. Of a lot of you are working on or will be working on capstone projects for this course, and so one of the most difficult things in my opinion is that EDA, because a lot of it's not just about memorizing the code or learning the proper format for things. It's all about the proper thought process for, how do I take a question that is probably very broad, like in this case, it's the main, the overarching goal of this case or question is about food security or food insecurity, right? That's something that's really broad. How do you even begin to tackle something like that? And so thinking about the process of EDA is thinking about how can I take a question that's that could be very broad, that could be something that is seems very difficult to answer, and how do I make almost a tree to make it more simple? How do I take that one broad question and narrow it down to something that's more specific, a good starting point? And so one of our goals for this case is, do I have enough information to solve this problem? And if not, how do I get additional information that I need to collect? How do I collect that information? So, we're going to go through that process of starting out with something really broad and narrowing it down to, towards the end of the case, we'll have a very particular question we're going to answer that can lead us back to getting back to starting to approach that really broad question. So our introduction and kind of business context for this case is focusing on hunger and food security. So in 2019, the United Nations issued a report on food security. There are 2 billion people that are currently experiencing moderate or severe food insecurity, meaning that they do not have enough food and they don't have a regular, consistent source of food. So, the report advocates for everyone to live in a world without hunger, food insecurity, and malnutrition in any of its forms. And so the report suggests that one way we can do this is to reduce variability in food production and increase the capacity to withstand food shortages and distribution disruptions. So, trying to make our food production more consistent so that everyone has that constant access to a reliable source of food. So an important part of food security is the food itself, who is producing which foods and how that has changed over time. So understanding the production, yield, and land usage of the world's most vulnerable populations can help us to get some insights from that. And so that's what we're going to be exploring today is particularly, our business problem. What are spatial and temporal trends, in crop production? And again, we'll talk a little bit about this, but that is a pretty, even though we've gone from something like food insecurity, which is broad, what's the question there per se, to something more specific, like, okay, let's focus in on those trends in crop production. That's still something that's pretty broad. So we'll talk about, how you approach that and narrow it down even further. So, like we talked about for our main goal for this case, we're going to explore techniques for information gathering and information sufficiency. Do we have enough information to answer our question? And we're going to focus on data from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. That data set is abbreviated as FAO STAT here. So this is the data set that we will use for our case today. And as a reminder, this is just an analytical case. The data is all here and it's already been analyzed, and we're just going to discuss that today. So don't worry if you're not seeing a data set or anything. So before we actually dive in, let me just keep an eye on this. So the EDA framework. So, I talked about how a question that we're starting with can be really broad, and, narrowing it down can be kind of a complicated process. So it's important when you start to do that, that you keep a couple of things in mind, right? So we take our really broad question about crop production, and we start to narrow it down. So, let's say in this case, we're going to focus on one particular crop, okay, for one particular country. So what's important is to keep in mind, not necessarily always focusing back on that one really broad question, but thinking about what question are we trying to answer right now? Okay, so if we were going to focus on corn production, which we are in this case, we're going to do coffee. But if we were going to look at corn, focusing on that one question and saying, do we have the information to answer it? What data do we need to answer our question? And do we have that data to answer it? Okay, so thinking about the one question you're working on right now, and not necessarily thinking on that big, broad question. And the reason for that is that you might get different results than you expect. So if we're looking at our one small question about corn, okay, and we make a prediction that corn production is going to increase over the next 20 years. But what if in our analysis, we find that corn production actually is going to decrease? Right? That could change our whole question. It could change our whole project. And you have to be prepared for that and open to that. So the other thing about EDA, exploratory data analysis, is that it's a process that can be kind of fluctuating, changing. It can be unexpected. And so, it's a good idea to be prepared for that, and to go kind of wherever your data takes you. So you might make a really interesting discovery that's really unexpected, that you never thought, like I said, maybe you expected corn production to increase and now it decreases. Well, maybe that's something really unexpected and kind of cool, and now takes your project in a whole new direction, and then can lead to new future questions based off of that one thing you found from that small specific question. And so that's why I said, when you're doing your own EDA, to not always think about that big, broad question or goal you had in mind. Think about that little question you're starting with and answering that and getting the data for that and thinking about the results of that, because that can really change the trajectory or, the way that your project is going to go. And so, to be open to that and not be disappointed by that is, just how this process goes. So that's kind of our overarching framework for EDA, how that works. And so these questions are really helpful, that you can refer to later when you're thinking about the steps to follow, and thinking about how you want to approach, exploratory data analysis. So let's actually go ahead and start in on some questions for our case. So, I've said this a couple of times now that, we want to narrow our outcome of interest. Our overall question for this case is, what are spatial and temporal trends in crop production? But we are gonna, we're gonna use this FAO stat data set. And then, we will dive in a little bit deeper into more specific questions. But the first thing that we're actually going to do here is, so when we are approaching that question, one thing that's important too is to find out what's already known about it, right? If you haven't done any research about your question, it's going to be, you're kind of starting from scratch, and you may be repeating analysis or, background that's already known. And so if you do some research ahead of time on your question, on your goal, that can guide you on where to start, what's already known, even give you ideas for where to find data based off of where other people have found data. So that's kind of what we'll start with our exercise 1, is thinking about, a little bit more details on this report that I discussed based off of on food security from the United Nations. So we're going to analyze some questions to start with, to get you in the right mindset for thinking about how do I gather my data. So is everyone following so far? Is everyone feeling, am I doing okay in terms of pace? Everyone's doing good? Okay. Okay, yes, someone's a little bit fast. Okay. Thank you for that. Okay, everyone's saying great. Okay, awesome. Okay, so, also if I'm talking a little bit fast from now on, you will be able to, I'll read the questions from exercise 1. So you can also follow along for exercise 1. And, oh, oopsies, let me go down. Sorry about that. Got to remember not to show the answers. Okay, so for exercise 1, let's talk about this. So one major question in reducing food insecurity is the issue mostly in production or in distribution? Is the issue mostly in production or in distribution? In other words, do we produce enough food to feed all the mouths, or do we simply not get it into the right hands fast enough? In July 2012, a research paper was published with the provocative title, "We already grow enough food for 10 billion people and still can't end hunger." So does this statement make sense when we talk about food insecurity? The problem is it that we already make a lot of food and we just aren't giving it to people? Or is the problem really that we don't actually produce enough food? Right, that's basically what we're talking about here. And this paper has said we do already grow enough food and can't end hunger, which suggests that we are not getting it to the people who need it. So which of the following data points are necessary and sufficient to make the statement above? So let's talk for a moment about necessary and sufficient. I will give a kind of brief overview, but for more information, you can click. There's this link here that has a really great article that explains more about what necessary and sufficient means in terms of statements. But if we're going to make a statement that is necessary and sufficient, so a necessary statement is to say that this one thing is, or this thing, it can be multiple things, is or are necessary for this other thing. So for example, oxygen is necessary for human life. Okay, does that make sense? You have to have oxygen. That is necessary for human life. That would be a necessary statement. But a sufficient statement says that if you have this thing or things, you will get this other thing, right? So, so oxygen is not sufficient for human life. Does that make sense to everyone? So, oxygen is necessary, but not sufficient, because oxygen by itself does not automatically give you human life. many, many more things are needed for human life than just oxygen. So to say that oxygen is necessary for human life is a necessary statement, but not sufficient to get human life. So something that would be sufficient, let's say, okay, like to get cookies, cookie dough and a heat source are sufficient for cookies, right? If you have cookie dough and a heat source, you're gonna have cookies. So when you're thinking about what is necessary and sufficient for this question, you need to think about if we had these statements, so you can make multiple selections here, but if we had this data, that would be, that data is necessary to say that we grow enough food for 10 billion people. And it would also be sufficient. If we had all of this data, we could say for sure or not that we grow enough food for 10 billion people. Okay, so if you're still a little bit confused about necessary and sufficient, we'll continue talking about it in the case, but also you can click on this later and get a refresher on what that means, or an introduction to what necessary and sufficient means. But let's go ahead and answer this question. So like I said, you can make multiple choices, but let's take a minute. I'll keep an eye on the live chat. And which data points here do you think are necessary and sufficient to make the statement above? A, so if we had these data points, right? So A, the amount of food grown in the world. B, the amount of food thrown away in the world. C, the amount of food a person needs to be food secure. Or D, additional information is required. Okay, lots of answers coming in. Some people are saying all of the above, A and C, all of them, A, B, and C. Okay, and just a quick note, Oscar, I don't see also the polls and answers. So I apologize for that. I don't think I'm in that channel quite yet. So that's my bad for asking everyone. If typically you don't post in the live chat, I'm sorry about that. Okay, so yeah, lots of answers. This is great. Okay, so yes, in the future, I can ask all of you to do the multiple choice and the polls and answers. So sorry for clogging up your live chat here. Okay, so let's discuss the answer. So the answer for exercise 1 is a lot of you were correct here, that there are definitely multiple answers, and the answers for this question are A, C, and D. So if we knew, we're thinking about 3 key points here that we would need to say that we already grow enough food for 10 billion people. So the first thing that we absolutely have to know is the amount of food that we produce. How much food do we produce? The second thing we absolutely have to know is the amount of food each person needs to be secure, right? Just knowing how much food we produce isn't enough to tell us that we already grow enough for 10 billion people. We also have to know how much food does one person need to be food secure. And then the third number that we need, which is why D is also correct, is we need to know the number of people in the world. So, that would tell us the existence of hungry people. And, it would also tell us if we were talking particularly about, food security, do we have enough food to feed everyone in the world? So if you just said A and C, I can see how you would say that as well. the D is a little bit tricky because the question already said, do we grow enough for 10 billion people? So you could almost disregard that number of people in the world, because the question here particularly, or the statement, was saying, giving you that number 10 billion. So you could go with A and C and just say, that we have enough food for 10 billion people. But, to talk about, to say that we can end, or, if we wanted to end hunger, it's better to also know how many people are in the world. So we could make this statement about, we have enough food to feed every person in the world, we just don't get it to them. Okay, so that's a little tricky about D. Okay. So for our next question, in November 2017, a research article investigated the FAO stat dataset to understand the international food trade network. In particular, they investigated what is called the community structure, which formalizes which groups of countries or regions trade more frequently with each other. So the statement that this report, that this research article made, is that our estimates indicate that the probability that two countries belong to the same food trade community depends more on geopolitical and economic factors, such as geographical proximity and trade agreement co-membership, than on country economic size and or income. Okay, so that is a very complicated statement. So let's think about what they're actually saying here. Okay, so what they're saying is that, the probability that you have two countries that are trading with each other, that are, providing food to each other, depends more on their geographical proximity, how close they are to each other, their relationship to each other in the world, are they near or far from each other, and then the trade agreements that they are part of. And the statement is saying that's more important. It depends more on those things than on the size of the economy of that country or its income, how much money it's making, right? So thinking about that statement, let's look at our question. So which of the following pieces of evidence, if true, would make you skeptical of the statement above? Which of these would make you doubt that statement? So a country's economic size is highly related to its geopolitical and economic factors. B, a country's economic size is highly variable over time. C, a country's economic size is highly related to the food trade community it is in. Or D, none of the above. So let's take a minute and also go ahead and answer the question in polls and answers, please. And let me know if you are confused about this question as well. And just as a reminder, you can, multiple answers can be correct here, so you can pick more than one. And just a reminder, we're going to polls and answers to answer this question. I'll keep an eye there, also on the opinions. Okay. Yes, and there are some good points in the live chat about economic size is absolutely an economic factor. Yes, so that that's a good point. Great observation. For the purpose of this question, we're going to think about economic size as something separate. So try to think about this statement in terms of what they're saying about geographical proximity and trade agreement co-membership as economic factors, and economic size is something different here, but great point about that. So for this question, I understand that, there can be a bit of confusion about, what are economic factors, things like that. But I also want you to think about this question in terms of its structure, right? We're thinking about, if we had this evidence, what would make you doubt this statement about factors that such as geographical proximity and trade agreement membership being more important than economic size or income? Okay, hopefully that clarifies it a little bit. Okay, let me check in. Yeah, so it looks like A and C are our most popular choices. Okay, so let's discuss the answer here. So if you said A, that is correct. So, because remember, we were trying to make a statement here, or we were trying to choose the, the statement that would make us doubt, or the piece of evidence that would make us doubt the statement that was made. So the reason that the answer is A, a country's economic size is highly related to its geopolitical and economic factors, is because we were trying, so it is A only because if the country's economic size is related to its geopolitical and economic factors that were measured, then it's not clear that you can say that being a part of this food trade community depends more on its geopolitical and economic factors than on economic size and income. If the two things are related, right? If economic size is highly related to its geopolitical and economic factors, it's very hard to say that one contributes more to being part of a food community than another. B is not correct. That is, a country's economic size is highly variable over time. We weren't talking, the statement had nothing to do with time or change over time or anything like that. So it's kind of irrelevant. And then C, that was another popular answer. A country's economic size is highly related to the food trade community it is in. So C is incorrect, because if you know that economic size is highly related to the food trade community membership, then that suggests the opposite of the statement being made. Okay, okay. So 1.3. Let me also keep track. Okay. So Killian Stokes is an adjunct lecturer on business and global development at the Quinn School of Business in UCD and the co-founder of Moyi Coffee Ireland, the world's first fair chain coffee. He noticed that Ethiopia is one of the countries in the world with the highest number of food insecure people, despite a thriving agricultural sector and high rates of crop production. In particular, it exports some of the world's finest coffee, which has led him to conclude, if Ethiopia started to develop its coffee industry, it could trade its way out of poverty. So which of the following pieces of evidence, if true, would be sufficiently convincing to conclude the statement above? So remember, when we're thinking about sufficiently convincing, that if we knew this one thing, then we could make the other statement. So if we knew, A, B, C, or D, then we could say if Ethiopia started to develop its coffee industry, it could trade its way out of poverty. So which one of these statements would convince you the most that then if it were true, Ethiopia could develop its coffee industry, could trade its way out of poverty. So A, Ethiopia has not developed its coffee industry and is still very impoverished. B, another country very geopolitically and economically similar to Ethiopia developed its coffee export industry in the last few decades and is now far more food secure. C, when Ethiopia's coffee export business was more developed in the past, it was less impoverished. Or D, every country that has developed its coffee industry has been able to trade its way out of poverty. So let's take a minute and think about this. We're trying to decide which of these statements, which piece of evidence, if it were true, would be convincing that if Ethiopia started to develop its coffee industry, it could trade its way out of poverty. And I see there are, sorry, I'm just reviewing the live chat. So yeah, I can see there was some confusion. Sorry, I missed that about the previous question. So while you're thinking about this question, let me just explain a little bit. I'll just, hopefully you have your case open. I'll just address really quickly some confusion about why C was incorrect. So A was the only correct answer for a previous question, okay? Because we were saying which one of these would make, this is complicated, so I should have kept my eye on live chat better so I could explain this. Our question was asking about which of these statements would make you skeptical. So C, of course, I guess C, yes, would make us skeptical because it's literally the exact opposite, and that's why it's incorrect. So A was the one that was correct because it makes you skeptical. It's still unclear. The statement could still be correct, but if A was true, it would make us skeptical. You can't necessarily make that conclusion. You would definitely need more evidence. C is not correct because if C were true, that wouldn't make you skeptical. That outright would show you that the statement is wrong. So yeah, kind of a tricky question there. So hopefully that explains a little bit more. The people that said C, you are correct. It is that it would definitely disprove your statement for question 2 here, but it wouldn't make you skeptical. It would completely disprove it. So hopefully that clarifies, and sorry I didn't address that earlier. So hopefully that clarifies. You are all doing a great job. You're on the right track here in thinking about these questions in the way that you should. So great job. And I think to remember here is that this can be very nuanced, and that's why we're discussing kind of these different pieces of evidence and how they would make you think about a question if you knew about them. So So sorry for backtracking. Let's come back to question 1.3 here, and check in on our polls and answers. Okay, question number 3. It looks like we have a lot of people choosing B, and second choice is D. Okay, so this is another one that is the answer starts out with saying this is a tricky question. So all of these are kind of nuanced questions, but B would be the most convincing. So remember, because I talked about our previous question, let's come back and think about this one. If Ethiopia started to develop its coffee industry, it could trade its way out of poverty. So we're thinking about which piece of evidence, if it was true, on its own would be sufficiently convincing to conclude the statement above. So the statement that is most likely here would be B. Another country that's very geopolitically and economically similar to Ethiopia developed its coffee export industry in the last few decades and is now far more food secure. So A doesn't work. So A is not the correct answer because it doesn't really say anything about the state of Ethiopia. You know, in a world where its coffee industry is developed, which is what we would need. So, you know, just saying Ethiopia has not developed its coffee industry and is still very impoverished, that doesn't say anything about what would happen if it did develop its coffee industry. So our other popular answer was D. Every country that has developed its coffee industry has been able to trade its way out of poverty. So the reason that this on its own would not be sufficiently convincing is because maybe every country that has developed its coffee industry has been very economically different from Ethiopia. And so that wouldn't necessarily say that if Ethiopia did the same thing, it would also prosper. It could trade its way out of poverty, because we don't know anything about, about every country. Just saying every country that has done this has been able to trade its way out of poverty doesn't necessarily mean that those countries were similar to Ethiopia in terms of their the amount of arable land they have, their economic size, trade agreements, all of those different factors. So another answer that is kind of a close second to B would be C. When Ethiopia's coffee export business was more developed in the past, it was less impoverished. So that's a tricky one, going back and forth between B and C, because that does say that when Ethiopia had developed its coffee export industry, it was less impoverished. So the reason that that's not necessarily correct is that the country may have changed in other ways in the time that has passed. And so, we don't know necessarily what Ethiopia was like then, and we don't know that just because they had developed it more in the past, that would still work for them in the future. We really, the best answer here would be to look at other countries that are more similar to the way Ethiopia is now, and to find out if, those countries developed their coffee industry, what happened to them, and would that same thing happen for Ethiopia? So that is basically what we are going to go ahead and do, is we're going to focus for the rest of this case on the statement. So we're going to remember the statement. If Ethiopia started to develop its coffee industry, it could trade its way out of poverty. Okay, that's going to be kind of our hypothesis going forward. And that's what we're going to focus on. Okay. So I guess, there are some questions in the live chat about this previous question. So the reason that we didn't choose more than one answer is we wanted to choose the one that is sufficiently convincing, the statement that is the most convincing. So that's why we chose B. So hopefully that clarifies why B and D are not correct, or why B and C are not correct. That B is by itself the most convincing. Okay. So like I said, we're going to focus on that third claim as our hypothesis about Ethiopia and its coffee industry. So this, we talked at the beginning about how important it is when you have a very broad question about, we wanted to first focus on food insecurity and then looking at crop production trends. And from there, we're focusing more now on one particular country and one particular crop, coffee. So you can see how we have gone from, through looking at our report, our FAO report, that we were able to gain some information and analyze some of the statements that were made. So we're going to start with something that is kind of a smaller question that we can tackle, we can find data for, we can validate or invalidate this hypothesis with our data, and kind of start our exploration here at something that is more specific, and then try to grow it out from there to go back to our original question about about crop trends in production. So we are going to now look at some different plots that are from this FAO stat data set. So I can make the screen bigger. Zoom in a little more. So we're first going to be looking at a couple of these plots here. So this first set is looking at coffee production from 1961 to 1971. I'll try to do this. Okay, so coffee production from 1961 to 1971. And then, we have this plot that's looking at production of coffee, green, top 10 producers for 1961 to 1971. So these are our countries that are top producers, our top 10 producers for that time period. And then we also have a plot here that is the production share of coffee, looking at this pie chart for these different regions. So, this is breaking it up in terms of all the coffee that's produced, what region is contributing most to that for this time period. The next thing that we can see scrolling down on our plots is then we have a separate time period. We have a later time period, 2007 to 2017. And so we can see again that we have, similar plots in terms of this map showing the tons of coffee that are produced in each region, and then our top 10 producers for this later time period. And then again, our production share of coffee by region. So take a second. We'll start with some of these warm-up questions just to familiarize ourselves with this data. And go ahead, if you have this open on your own, kind of look at these, see what you notice as well. But let's try to answer some of these questions. So for the first one, why are some of the countries in the world maps white? So let's start with that one first. I'll scroll back up. So some of these countries were white. Why do you think that is? Okay, yeah, excellent. So great answers, no production. Some are saying we don't have data, don't produce coffee or no data. Yep. So the answer for this one is that there are countries where data, these are countries where data is not collected or reported to FAO Stat. So yeah, we have these countries in white, and it's safe to assume that there's no data for these countries. And yeah, so I made a good point. There isn't a legend here on this first one, so that would be helpful. We'll assume that it is the same as the second one here, but for the purpose of this case, it won't be super important for us to have this legend. But it's a great point. When you are making your own plots, always make sure you have a legend for them. Okay. And yeah, there's a question about, without first looking to data, how would we have deduced that coffee was the crop to look at? So we actually decided to do this to focus on coffee based off of this United Nations report, and let me scroll back up really quick. We'll take a quick second because this is important. So here, so we were pretending that all of us together, we all did our research ahead of time on this question about food security. We read through people's commentary on this FAO Stat report that was released. Killian Stokes, he noticed, he came out with this report, or this opinion based off of his knowledge and data, that if Ethiopia started to develop its coffee industry, it could trade its way out of poverty. So, the reason that we decided to look at coffee is, based off of this report, and based off of, we see that this FAO Stat has data on coffee. This is a hypothesis we can try to test out pretty easily based off of that data. Well, I say easily, but we'll actually find it's, all these questions are pretty complex. But we focused on that through our research and through, looking at other people's statements and the things that they have said. So when you're doing your own exploratory data analysis, it is perfectly fine to look at what other people have done in the past or their own hypotheses and try to test them out based off of data. So we used coffee as an example here, but let's say, you could have if you had wanted to answer this question and you had the FAO Stat data in front of you, you could have picked any crop, really. I think where you start is completely up to you. We started with this because it was a hypothesis that had been made that we could test. So let's come back to our questions. Our second question is, what is the crop called, why is the crop called coffee green? So we see here in each of our graphs, it says production share of coffee green by region. And again, coffee green, all of this is based off of coffee green. What does that mean? Yeah, everyone, perfect, good answers, unprocessed, not toasted, not roasted. Yeah, yep, absolutely, great job. So green coffee is the unroasted coffee. So that is what is harvested out of the fields. So then our last question, what is the difference between Ethiopia PDR and Ethiopia? So this is a great point, that when you're comparing your data, it's very important, to make sure that you are comparing the right things to each other and noticing other factors that could affect your data analysis. So right off the bat, one thing that's different in these comparisons is we have Ethiopia PDR for 1961 to 1971 and 2007 to 2017. So if you don't know the answer to this question, that's perfectly okay. I will tell you the answer to it in a moment if anyone doesn't know. Yeah, some people are saying, yeah, socialist government. Yeah, had a different government. So excellent job. So these are things to look at when you are when you're analyzing your data. Some things right off the bat when you're going to make comparisons is, are there other factors to consider? Things like a different kind of government. There was a socialist government in place in Ethiopia for some time prior, and so making those comparisons, there will always be compounding variables, and we will see that in this analysis as well. So let's continue. Okay, so exercise 2. Notice the shift in share of coffee production from the 1960s to 2010s for Asia, 6.7% to 30.2%. Based on the plots above, what is likely the most significant driver of this? So we saw, let me go back and just remind you, we were looking at these plots that show here, Asia had 6.7% of total production. And then later, Asia has 30.2%. So we want to look at, based off of the other data in those plots, the other countries, what is likely the most significant driver of that increase in the production share? Is it A, Brazil stagnating on its coffee production, which let Asian countries take a larger share of the pie? So think about, is that a true statement? B, Vietnam developing its coffee production industry in a major way. C, Angola leaving the coffee production stage, which let Asian countries take a larger share of the pie. Or D, cannot determine from the plots provided. So again, let's answer this in polls and answers. So we're thinking about, based off of the data that we have on the plots from two different time periods, why did Asia, what's a possible answer for why Asia has a much larger share now of the coffee production? Okay, so we'll go a little, I'm not going to give quite as long. I see that we have quite a few answers for B. I'm going to go ahead and talk about the answer so that, since we're only on exercise 2, and I definitely want to give us the opportunity to discuss some of the really interesting things we'll find in this case. So for exercise 2, B is correct. So what would be the most significant driver? Vietnam developing its coffee production industry in a major way. So we saw, if we go back, that the first answer, Brazil, it looks like did not stagnate. Brazil is still a #1 producer. Brazil still, it increased from our previous time point, which was 1961 to 1971. Brazil was a top producer and continues to be a top producer. So it doesn't look like they stagnated per se. They still have a pretty large share of coffee production. But what we do notice is all of a sudden in our later time point, Vietnam has all of a sudden moved into spot #2, and Vietnam was not present at all in 1961 to 71. So we can say that that is most likely. We also, there was one of the answers, or excuse me, one of the options was Angola dropping off. So it is true that Angola left the top 10, but Angola did not have they were not a huge coffee producer to start with. They weren't, producing a whole lot of coffee. So them leaving doesn't necessarily give enough room for, them dropping off doesn't lead to that huge increase. It's most likely that, it's really Vietnam drastically increasing their coffee production that leads to Asia having a larger share. So does this make sense? Why we think that Vietnam is B is the most likely answer? Okay. Okay, exercise 3, based on the results of exercise 2 and the hypothesis we are investigating, come up with a sensible way to proceed. So this is kind of an open-ended question. So, based off of what we said for exercise 2, which was that Asia went from 6.7% of the share of coffee production to 30.2%. And our most significant driver, we think, is that Vietnam developed its coffee production industry in a major way based off of the data that we saw. So based off of those results and our hypothesis, let's remember our hypothesis as well. And that is that if Ethiopia developed its coffee industry more, it could help to get out of poverty. So remember, our original hypothesis is about Ethiopia. So based off of these things, come up with a sensible way to proceed. How do you think that we should go forward now with this data? Okay, these are good answers. Oh, so someone asked what question. So the question, we're on exercise 3. Sorry, I didn't scroll down more. I just didn't want to show a possible answer. But the question we're answering right now is, how would you go forward based off of our results about Vietnam developing its coffee production and our hypothesis about Ethiopia? What could we do with this data that we have? How could we go forward? So yeah, we could check Vietnam, how they're doing in terms of food security. Were they able to trade their way out of poverty? Need to see if the increase in coffee production for Vietnam actually decreases its hunger. Compare Vietnam, old Vietnam with current Ethiopia. Absolutely, these are great answers. So do we know if Vietnam has similar conditions to Ethiopia? Yeah, that's something that we should look into. Yeah, comparisons of Ethiopia and Vietnam. Yes, absolutely. So definitely on the right track. Yeah, check Vietnam's improvement in food security. Absolutely. So I think for the most part, it seems like everyone's on the right track here, on the same page. So yeah, for this, we can see that both Brazil and Vietnam significantly increase their coffee production. So, if we go back to our original hypothesis about Ethiopia, if Ethiopia developed its coffee production, it could trade its way out of poverty. So what we want to do is think about, okay, well, what are successful countries that have really strong coffee industries, that are top coffee producers? Because we want to try to get Ethiopia up there as well, to be a top coffee producer, to see if that will help them trade their way out of poverty. But we need to find an analog for Ethiopia, right? So we know from our data, Brazil and Vietnam are pretty successful in terms of their coffee production. But now we need to know, are either of these countries similar to Ethiopia in any way? Could we use them as an analog? Okay, so that is what we're going to do. So we're going to compare the coffee production in Ethiopia versus Brazil to start with. So, our first country is going to be Brazil, because that was a top producer. And these are some good points about just checking out on the live chat. Yeah, if Vietnam was in a war. Yeah, so this is something that there will always be confounding variables in your data. But it is important, we will look at Brazil and Vietnam over long stretches of time. And we're going to focus on the trends and what we see kind of initially. But I think it's wonderful that you are all on the right track in terms of thinking about other factors that could be responsible for any of the trends that we notice with both Brazil and with Ethiopia, or excuse me, with Brazil and with Vietnam, because I think, you know, these are great points that are being made in the live chat, because your data analysis should absolutely include your own knowledge and knowledge of what occurred in these regions around that time. And this goes for anything you do for your exploratory data analysis. You should never just rely on what the data tells you, the trend that you saw in your data. And if anything looks odd to you, don't ignore it. You know, you should always try to add your own brain, your own thoughts into the data that you're seeing and the trends that you're noticing, to say, based off of what I know from my research, or what I know about, you know, someone made a good point about global warming and maybe growing different kinds of crops, things like that. When you're thinking yourself about what else could explain this trend I'm seeing in my data, that is absolutely what you should be doing. You should never be blind to the other things that could be occurring, that could be creating those trends that you see. So never just rely on that trend you see in your data. You know, always be thinking about what could be confounding variables, what were other things going on at the same time. So this is, you know, you are all on the right track in terms of thinking about, well, what else could be causing this? For the purposes of this case, we're gonna, you know, focus on some particular things here. But it's absolutely reasonable to say what happened, you know, in Brazil, in Ethiopia, and Vietnam in those time periods, aside from their just raw numbers for coffee production. So for now, let's just look at our data. What does our data say? We're going to look first, like I said, at Brazil. So we're going to look overall for our world kind of coffee production. So this is the production and yield quantities of coffee in the world. So this is from 1961 to 2017. The blue, we have a legend down here, is the coffee that's harvested. And this is in red is the coffee that's produced. So that kind of gives us an overall trend. And just to clarify, we'll be discussing things like tons and hectares. So tons will be the weight, the amount of coffee that's actually produced. And then hectares would be the amount of land, the space that is actually harvested of coffee. So more important than our overall world trends, you know, it's important to know has for the whole world, has coffee production increased, decreased, you know, held pretty consistent over time? Has it been really variable? Has there been a lot of up and down, or has it held pretty steady? So that's why we first look at our world production, just to get an idea of, you know, if we saw like a huge dip in coffee production around a certain time period, that could influence our data as well, or the things we take into consideration. If the whole world had some issue with coffee production or coffee harvest, that could affect our data. But if we focus in on Ethiopia versus Brazil, so remember, we are trying to look at where Ethiopia is now and how that compares to where Brazil, or in the future where Vietnam were, you know, 20 years ago, for that 1960 to you know, 1990, I guess, time period. So we want to look at you know, do these countries where they used to be, is that similar to Ethiopia? Does that make sense? Because we're trying to help Ethiopia grow. So we need to we don't want to compare Ethiopia now to Brazil now, because Brazil right now is a huge coffee producer. We already know they're successful. So it doesn't help us to compare Ethiopia, who might be struggling now, to Brazil, who's super successful. We want to say, does Ethiopia, where Ethiopia is now, compare to where Brazil was in that 1960 to 1990 time period? Okay, we want to look at where they were. Good question. The y-axis here is hectares. So we're looking at how much, basically, so you don't have to worry, you know, too much about your y-axis in this case. We're mostly going to look at the trends overall, but this is just saying how much land was harvested. We harvested 2 million hectares. This point would be around 2 million hectares of coffee. So that's just the amount of land that we're using, that we're harvesting coffee from. So, and then down here we'll look at tons, and that's the weight. How much physical coffee did we get from that land? So our first graph here, we're looking at Brazil in blue versus Ethiopia in red for their coffee, how much coffee they harvested. So now let's look at a comparison for their production. So again, this was in tons. But like I said, we don't have to worry too much about the numbers on your axis. We're mostly looking at trends here. So again, blue is Brazil for their coffee production. And then this is how much coffee was produced from Ethiopia. And remember, this is green. When we say coffee produced, these are the green coffee beans. So this isn't necessarily, roasted coffee. This is how much they've harvested. Okay. And there are some really good points about the area of land, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And again, we want to focus on trends, not so much raw numbers, but that's a great question to look at percentage. Here, hectares, we do know raw numbers in terms of the amount of land, but knowing the percentage of maybe the total area, things like that would be very important. So the final graph we'll look at as our comparison for Brazil versus Ethiopia is yield, which is basically, okay, I'm forgetting what HG is now. I think it's something, it's like, oh goodness. Oh, this is escaping me. This was not something I was familiar with before this case, this HG versus HA. So this is basically amount of coffee per hectare. Okay, so if anyone knows in the chat, if you can put that in, or maybe Google it. Oh, hectograms. Okay, yes, perfect. Thank you so much. Hectograms per hectare. Okay, so hectograms. So, that we'll think about this as amount or weight, amount of coffee produced per area for the amount of land. That's what's the most important. But thank you so much for someone Googling that super quick. So when we're thinking about our coffee yield, that is amount of coffee that we get per our land unit, which in this case is hectares. So how much coffee are we getting per hectare? So again, we're comparing Brazil in blue versus Ethiopia in red. Okay, so these are going to be our three comparisons for our Brazil versus Ethiopia. And remember, we wanted to look at where Ethiopia is now and where Brazil used to be. So for this, based off of these plots alone, these three plots, is Brazil's coffee production industry in the first 2 decades, 1960 to 1980, is that comparable to Ethiopia's coffee production industry in the last 2 decades, 1990 to 2010? Why or why not? So based off of this, can we say that Brazil would be a good country for us to use as an analog for Ethiopia, just based off of this data? I understand very good points have been made about confounding variables, other things to think about. For this case, just think about these numbers, right? This data that we have. I'll go back to the top and remind you, we were comparing these three graphs we're looking at this time period for Brazil versus our red here for Ethiopia, where Ethiopia is now, for amount of coffee produced and for yield. Yeah, good answers in the live chat. So quite a few people are saying no, they're not really comparable. Similar yield, but different area of harvest. Yeah. Okay, awesome. So people are saying that this is not a good comparison, and I would agree with you. So we would say that no, Brazil is not necessarily the best analog for Ethiopia. So let's go back and look at these charts again, right? We're comparing here. Ethiopia has a pretty low number of hectares that they are harvesting versus Brazil had they, you know, and it's pretty stagnant. It's increasing a little bit, and Brazil had the opposite trend. For 1960 to 1980, they were decreasing their amount of land that they were harvesting. So then in terms of coffee production, we can see that Brazil for this time period is super variable. They are very up and down in terms of their amount of coffee that they were getting for their land, or excuse me, amount of coffee that they were producing. Versus Ethiopia, again, is slightly increasing, but pretty stagnant, and they're not super variable here. There's not a lot of of that variability that we see. And then for the yield, it is, I would say that this is maybe an okay comparison in terms of the yield that we see. It's pretty similar. Ethiopia seems to be a little bit up and down as well, and Brazil as the same. But based off of this data, we would not say that it's the best analog for Ethiopia, or a good model that we should continue to analyze. And a lot of that comes from Ethiopia, or excuse me, from Brazil actually decreasing the amount of land that they wanted to use for coffee production. And Ethiopia was kind of increasing. So let's actually now switch to Vietnam. And I just want to clarify, pause here. Does this make sense for why we aren't using Brazil as our analog? Yeah, people are saying Brazil made it more efficient. Yeah, that's a good answer. So, they just had different, in terms of different priorities, their trends for 1960 to 1980 were really different from where Ethiopia is right now. Okay, so let's look at Vietnam. I'm sorry, I think, okay, yes, and someone's asking to repeat. Sorry, I think I lose track of myself when I start talking very quickly. I get excited about what we're talking about. So I'll just reiterate very quickly a quick recap of what we talked about. So we were again comparing where Ethiopia is now in terms of, let's go, this graph is the best one, I think. So Ethiopia is now, because we want to find a country that was similar in 1960 to 1980 to where Ethiopia is right now. So we can see here that Ethiopia has, they are trying to devote more land. They're harvesting slightly more hectares over time of land for coffee. But Brazil, when we look at 1960 to 1980, actually started decreasing the amount of land. Someone made a good point in the live chat that could be that they focused more on increasing yield, less land, more coffee. And we don't necessarily know that would be an option for Ethiopia, but they had a different trend for 1960 to 1980 than what Ethiopia looks like right now. So it wouldn't be a good comparison. They did really different things back then. The same, here we saw that the amount of coffee they were getting in Brazil was really variable, very up and down. And we don't see that here for Ethiopia. They are pretty consistent and rising slightly in terms of the amount of coffee that they're harvesting. And then, yield is an okay comparison. It's kind of up and down over the years, and that was kind of the way it was for Brazil as well. Okay. Okay, and good questions about what determines a country to be a good comparison with Ethiopia. And that is a really difficult question to answer. And you'll see that even here, we won't necessarily have a perfect analog. I know I'm giving away a little bit of the conclusion, but that is a really complicated question. And if you were doing an all-out full data analysis, you would want to try to look at as many points as possible between the two countries before you're making a comparison. So here we're going to make just a general suggestion. We are by no means going to make any sort of final conclusion based off of, Vietnam's coffee production, because really good points in the live chat are being raised. And we talked about this, about compounding variables. It's very hard to compare and to say that one country is a perfect comparison for another. But here we're just going to use kind of general trends to say, could this be a good starting point for comparison? But you would look at many different factors in terms of, if you were doing a full all-out analysis here. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and look at Vietnam, because in our data, Vietnam was another one that went from being not even on the top 10 in our kind of 1960, 1980 data points to being a number 2 producer behind Brazil for our 2007 to 2017 data points, which means they have made a significant improvement. So maybe they could be a better analog. So let's look at their coffee production. So we have very similar graphs. And so now we're looking at coffee for Vietnam in blue, and then Ethiopia in red. So again, we're looking at, this is the amount of land that was harvested. So, or the area that was harvested. So, again, Vietnam in blue, and then Ethiopia in red. I was about to talk about those trends, but I first want you to look at these graphs, the same that we did with Brazil, and thinking about, again, where Ethiopia is now versus where Vietnam was. And again, thinking about the coffee, this is the tons, this is the amount of coffee that is harvested, amount of coffee that is produced for Ethiopia versus Vietnam. And then again, looking at yield. So before we, I know you probably have this open, so let's not talk about agricultural area. We're going to look at a little more data for Vietnam than we did for Brazil, because we decided not to continue with Brazil. But how do we feel about using Vietnam as an analog for Ethiopia? In terms of their, their land that's harvested, the amount of coffee that they're getting, and their yield, things like that. Yeah, so good comments about Ethiopia seems to be a better analog than Brazil. They do have similar trends. Some people are pointing out some points that would make them saying that maybe they still aren't the best for comparison. And it would maybe be difficult to find an exact perfect comparison. But we might say here, I agree that it's still not quite the right fit, but it's better than Brazil, right? And since we are looking for a country that has really increased their production, we are limited in terms of the countries in our case here that we want to compare to, because we want to compare to a really successful country who has gone from being not a huge producer to being a huge producer. So that's another reason why Brazil wasn't a great fit. Brazil has always been kind of a top coffee producer. Vietnam was not. And Ethiopia has not been. We saw on our bar graphs in the previous section, Ethiopia back in 1960 to 1980 was not a very big producer. And even now in 2007 to, well, not really now, but in our more recent time point, 2007 to 2017 is still not really a player. So, we want to try to compare. I think, we can go ahead and we're going to use Vietnam. Vietnam made that jump. And they did, they went ahead and, increased the amount of land that they used. So it is accurate to say that, here, maybe they aren't the best comparison to Ethiopia, because here they really had not that much land and they were producing not that much coffee. But in terms of the trends, Ethiopia, has increased their amount of land. We can see, or excuse me, that Vietnam has increased their amount of land and Ethiopia is trying to do the same. So maybe this type of comparison is better. They've increased land. We can see that Ethiopia is also trying to do that. And here we can see that maybe this is better. Their amount of coffee that's produced, is still kind of trying to increase. It's not, like someone said, not a perfect comparison, but better than Brazil in terms of the trends, right? Over time, they seem to be trying to increase these things at a pretty steady level. And then yield. So this is going to be one of our confounding variables. If you haven't noticed it already, that both of the countries, Brazil and Vietnam, made a concerted effort to try to increase yield, right? So not only do we see that Vietnam increased the amount of land, they also have increased their yield. But that is something I want to talk about in just a couple of minutes. Let's not focus too much on that right now. We want to go into our next plots, which are on agricultural area. So we are looking here at agricultural area for 1961 to 2017 for Ethiopia. Their arable land, which is the amount of land that they have available for crop production, the land that they have under permanent crops, and then land they have under permanent meadows and pastures, which would suggest it's not necessarily available for us to grow on. And then comparing that with Vietnam. So, and their trends over time. So let's look at, so we kind of answered exercise number 5 about is it comparable, but I want to focus now on this agricultural area to say, based off of this plot now, do we also feel that way? Are they pretty comparable in terms of, maybe like the percentage of arable land they have available, or the things that you notice about these two plots? Yeah, and good points about type of coffee. So let's, I do want to talk about that in a moment. So hang on to your comments because I want to hear them in just a moment about these other factors. But first, let's focus just on land. If we're comparing the amount of land that's available and the trends for Ethiopia versus Vietnam, do you think that, or I guess, what do you notice about these trends? I won't tell you what you should notice. The graphs. So these graphs are not only for coffee. This is total agricultural area. Their arable land, land they have under permanent crops, which would mean that, in red, that's the amount of land that they have for devoted to crops, coffee and otherwise. Yeah, Vietnam's increased its permanent crops, increased efficiency. Ethiopia is bigger. Yeah, and so let's think about percentages as well, because obviously, yes, these countries are different sizes as well in terms of, we see this graph going all the way up to 40,000 and here's 15. But so let's talk about this, because one thing that we notice is they do have, Vietnam, you would say maybe had more arable land in this period of 1960 to 1980. A greater percentage. But what we notice is that, we already saw up above that Vietnam went ahead and devoted way more land over time. They started drastically increasing the amount of land that they were harvesting coffee from. And we can see that reflected down here in terms of, we see way more of their land going to permanent crops, that they are devoting more land to coffee, that they made more of that land available for growth, and they decided to expand. And that led to an increase in the amount of coffee that they were harvesting as well. So they really increased their land that they were using for coffee. They really increased the amount of coffee that they were harvesting. And we can see here that maybe that's a good comparison for Ethiopia, who also has quite a bit of land. They have, overall increased their total amount over time, just like Vietnam. And Ethiopia, we can see, has more arable land, and they have not really increased the amount that they have under permanent crops. And so, maybe that could be a potential recommendation here for Ethiopia, is that if you can increase the amount of land you can devote to coffee, that could lead to greater coffee production, which makes sense, right? That it makes sense. If you're going to grow more coffee, you're going to get more coffee. So let me check in that live chat. Yeah, so yes, great comments in the live chat about, yeah, so we definitely can, it seems to be for both of these countries that they had room to grow, and it seems in terms of their coffee production, and it seems like Vietnam took advantage of that. And so Ethiopia could as well. So we also want to look at the coffee exports, right? So will this translate into more money just because you're producing more coffee? So, and I guess actually this is a good time to talk about yield, right? So as we're going to talk about coffee exports and how that translates to more money, we looked at some differences in terms of, yes, we saw, and let me go back up here. So we did see that Vietnam increased the amount of land that they devoted, they got more coffee, and they have higher yield. So that leads us, people made some really excellent points in the live chat about how there could be other variables, like the type of coffee that you grow, things like that. And so when you are, okay, because I guess let me go back one quick second. So we see here that Ethiopia harvests pretty much the same amount of land, right? They're pretty on trend in terms of raw numbers, right? Not the percentage, but just raw numbers of land that they're harvesting for coffee. They are not getting the same number of tons. So that might suggest that Ethiopia will have to devote more land than Vietnam has to coffee just to meet Vietnam's coffee production. But it's, a great point that was made in the live chat is that, and so this translates into, yield differences. For the same amount of land, Vietnam is getting more coffee than Ethiopia is, right? But they're also possibly growing different kinds of coffee. So someone put that in the live chat that Ethiopia grows the same coffee that Colombia grows, but Vietnam is growing Robusta coffee, which is kind of a more bitter coffee. It's a higher yield coffee, but you also have to think about quality of coffee, right? So there are other factors. You can't grow the same variety that's grown in Ethiopia and Colombia. You can't grow them packed together like you can with Robusta coffee. You can't necessarily just pack your plants in. It's a more delicate coffee than Robusta coffee, right? So and there are a lot of factors to think about. So I know that we won't necessarily talk about all of these in this case. This would be a full blown out, huge data analysis that you can do. But there are so many considerations to take into consider, so many considerations to think about when we're making recommendations. So it's absolutely reasonable to say that, yeah, we can increase our land here, devote that to coffee and get more coffee. But we want to think about variety that Ethiopia is growing versus Vietnam. We also want to think about when we're making any sort of recommendations or when we're making conclusions, think about the future, about are these, you could look into these varieties and say, how drought tolerant are they? How tolerant will they be to a changing climate? We know that we are facing, changes in our climate in terms of global warming, things like that, climate change, and how will these varieties withstand that kind of change in terms of the future? So is it worthwhile for Ethiopia to continue growing that same Colombian variety, or is it worth it for them to switch to Robusta? Is that a more tolerant crop? So many things to think about besides just land. It's absolutely reasonable here from our data to say we should increase the amount of land. We don't know if Ethiopia can grow that Robusta coffee that's higher yield, or other varieties that are higher yield. So I've been talking a lot, and so I want to know your thoughts now. I gave you some of mine, and so I want to know in the live chat, a lot of you brought up great points about confounding variables. So when we say that we need to, that from the trends that we've noticed, what are things that you think about in terms of these comparisons? What are confounding variables that you think about in terms of increasing yield, in terms of if any of you know about these coffee varieties? And it seems, yeah, so someone put in the live chat a picture of the Arabica coffee versus Robusta coffee. So, thinking about all of these different things, that Arabica sells better, but Robusta is easier to grow. Yeah, so that you have, these things to keep in mind that are not just, this is the point I really want to convey, that it's not just about what your data says, right? That it's not just about, oh, okay, we'll increase land and we'll increase coffee. Absolutely, that is a good conclusion. But it's important to think about all these other things. And I see people are typing, and I will absolutely, I give you a minute to think about what you want to say here. Because we noticed that we saw these changes in terms of, like I pointed out here, the amount of land, they're growing the same amount of land, but one country is getting a much higher yield than the other for that same amount of land. But we don't want to just take that on its face. We don't just want to look at that and say, oh, well, we should just follow what Vietnam is doing in terms of, trying to match them for yield. There are other considerations, right? Okay, really good thoughts here, really good points. So someone said that the cost of importing and producing maybe the chemicals or pesticides, or this is a great point about just the materials needed to grow, could be higher for one country than another for Ethiopia, and could limit them in terms of the types of coffees that they could even grow. Some suggestions: the best way to increase yield per hectare production. Yeah, possibly trying to help them increase their yield in a way that's feasible for Ethiopia. More land doesn't mean more yield suitable for coffee production. That's also something to think about. Is Ethiopia also has to weigh whether or not it's worthwhile to continue to grow coffee on that arable land. But I guess we should also say, we're looking at our hypothesis here about will helping Ethiopia to improve. That's the other thing. We want to think about our main hypothesis about Ethiopia growing more coffee will help them to get out of poverty. So I know I'm getting us a little off track and thinking about all these other variables, and I promise I'll bring us back around. But I think it's so important to think about, not just your data, but the things behind your data, and not just making kind of blind conclusions based off of what you see, but thinking about what's behind all of them. And a good point about fertilizers. Yeah, absolutely. And whether or not it's feasible to be using certain types of fertilizers, whether these two countries are comparable in terms of those things. And we should, I mentioned, climate impact. We should really look at future projections, right, of Ethiopia versus Vietnam's climate. Soil capabilities. Yeah, absolutely. What does the soil composition even look like? We can get super specific. Yeah, and we will get to a good point about export. I wanted to talk about this first, and then we'll continue on with our looking at the export differences between the countries and things like that. But I think talking about, actual growing conditions and the things to keep in mind. I think the best point that was made was a little bit of context in knowing that someone brought up in the live chat, which was great, that Vietnam was growing that Robusta coffee versus Ethiopia growing Arabica, which is also grown in Colombia. So thinking that, I think, is like the most important thing also that we need for context here in terms of even capabilities for these two countries to expand. They've made some choices in terms of maybe coffee quality. Okay, really good points. And yeah, someone made a great point about trade agreements that we saw previously, thinking about the geopolitical situation of Ethiopia versus Vietnam. So these are all really, really wonderful points, and absolutely things that you should think about. So let's get back on track for our case. So let's refocus. We talked about exercise 5. So we did think it was comparable. Vietnam versus Ethiopia, they are pretty similar. We have talked about the changes that Vietnam made that might be applicable to Ethiopia, one of them being devoting more land. Now, let's talk about the coffee. Can we compare the coffee exports in Ethiopia versus Vietnam? Okay, so does this translate? Our hypothesis was, will making more coffee for Ethiopia helped them to trade their way out of poverty? So let's see, has that happened for Vietnam? They've obviously increased their yield of coffee, and they became, like we saw in our previous bar graph, they became a top producer over time, second only to Brazil. So let's look at the money that they've gotten, their export value for Vietnam versus Ethiopia. So we saw that Vietnam increased their land, they increased the tons of coffee that they were producing, and has that led to an increase in exports, compared to Ethiopia? And let's look at a second graph here for Vietnam's export quantity. So this is actually also a good point to think about. Is the coffee that you're harvesting, are you able to export that coffee? So just because you've harvested it, can you sell it? Can you export it? And how much of it are you actually able to export? There are also maybe leading back to those differences in terms of the two varieties. Maybe one is a more delicate variety. You don't actually, it could be that you would have to look into, for the amount that you're harvesting, can you export 100% of that? Or are there certain caveats in terms of care for those green coffee beans that is, you have to take more care with maybe the Arabica variety than the Robusta. So I know that's getting us back to thinking about all those other things you could do, but it's important to look at these graphs as well. So for Vietnam, we can see, so let's go ahead and answer exercise 6. Based on these two plots, looking at the amount of money that they're getting for their coffee and how much they're exporting, what are some differences between coffee exports in Vietnam versus Ethiopia? So this is a multiple choice question. And so let's answer this question, and then we can continue to discuss this a little bit. So what are those differences? And we can select all that apply. So we'll go ahead and use polls and answers again, please. A, Vietnam's coffee export value has been increasing since 1990, while Ethiopia's coffee export value has remained roughly constant. B, Vietnam's coffee export quantity has been increasing since 1990, while Ethiopia's coffee export quantity has remained roughly constant. C, both Vietnam's and Ethiopia's coffee export quantity have been increasing since 1990, but Vietnam's coffee export quantity has been increasing at a much higher rate. Or D, there are no differences. Vietnam and Ethiopia have entirely comparable coffee exports. So let's take a minute to answer exercise 6. We're looking at the differences in coffee exports between Vietnam and Ethiopia. And you have such great points in the live chat. This is wonderful. So people are making a lot of points about our previous discussion about Vietnam having access to the sea and better infrastructure for trade. Absolutely. So you are all thinking about the right things. If you were to pursue something like this as a project, so many different factors for a question that we thought was pretty narrow, right? That we're just looking at coffee for Ethiopia, but so many other things have come into play here that are really, really interesting points that you also have to think about, that could explain the trends that you're seeing. So awesome job here. Okay, so let's check in polls and answers, please. Yeah, lots of answers coming in. Awesome. So it seems like for exercise 6, which is discussing the differences between Vietnam and Ethiopia, a lot of you are putting down, it looks like B, and then C is our second most popular answer. Okay, so let's go ahead and discuss the answer here. Okay, so the answer here is C. So both Vietnam and Ethiopia's coffee export quantity have been increasing since 1990, but Vietnam's coffee export quantity has been increasing at a much higher rate. And I understand, so B is also, I think, a valid answer in this case. You can see in these trends that for both, Ethiopia is increasing, right? It is slightly increasing in terms of export quantity, and also export value. And this is kind of a slight increase over time, and you can see that Vietnam is drastically increasing at a much higher rate. So you could say it really depends on what you define as roughly constant versus slightly increasing. So the technically correct answer here is C, since it has been slightly increasing, but in my opinion, I think B is also valid. And when I first looked at this, I thought, yeah, it's pretty constant to me. So I would say if you said either one of those in terms of your data analysis, they would be correct answers. But yeah, the main point here is that Vietnam has really, really increased over time at a much higher rate, their amount that they're exporting. Okay. So how does this information change or not your conclusions from question 4.4? So let's go back to question 4.4. Let's remind ourselves. Yeah, so question 4 was based on the plots alone, is Brazil's coffee production industry in the first, okay, sorry, let me go back. Question 1. Just a second, sorry. Yeah, so our question 6.2, how does the information change or not your conclusion from question 4, which was thinking about, is Ethiopia comparable to Vietnam? And honestly thinking about basically all of what we've talked about in terms of Ethiopia versus Vietnam. So excuse me, our multiple choice question. So how does this information change our conclusions? A, it strengthens the conclusion that there is room for growth in Ethiopia's coffee industry by producing and exporting more coffee. B, this does not change the conclusion that Ethiopia could economically benefit from devoting more land to coffee production. C, this weakens the conclusion that Ethiopia could economically benefit from devoting more land to coffee production. Or D, the information is not related to the conclusions. So thinking about, I don't really agree that it's question 4.4, but thinking about our conclusions about the comparisons that we made about whether or not we could compare Ethiopia to Vietnam. And just as a reminder, let's put this in polls and answers, please. Yeah, I agree. It's a good point. I don't think there is a 4.4. So we're going based off of our conclusions about the trends that we noticed in terms of our comparisons. So, our information about exports, once we found out our information about exports, how does that change or not what we thought about previously in terms of our conclusions for the Ethiopia versus Vietnam comparison, and how Ethiopia could improve based off of Vietnam as a model. So does that make sense? We're thinking about when we say how does this information, we're thinking about these two export graphs. And our answer to this question about their export quantity. Okay, so a lot of people are saying A. That looks like our most popular answer. And that is correct. So this, strengthens the conclusion that there is room for growth in Ethiopia's coffee industry by producing and exporting more coffee. So hopefully this makes sense. Let me know if you have any questions in the live chat. That what we've seen so far is that Vietnam dedicated more land to coffee. And we saw that Ethiopia has more land that they could devote to coffee. We saw for Vietnam that led to increases in exports and increases in terms of monetary value, the money they were getting from those exports. And so that leads us to believe that this could be the same for Ethiopia, that they could also devote more land and possibly, increase their export quantity and therefore money from those exports. Yeah, and a good point in the live chat. But what about if it's cheaper for Vietnam to produce and export coffee and it's not so economically attractive for Ethiopia? Absolutely. These are all the this is just one part of what we would look at in terms of comparisons for these trends. After we have an initial trend, we would need to look into these other factors to see if it's viable, dig into more data. These are kind of our initial, some initial trends that we notice. And we are going to actually discuss that right now. So, we're summarizing our conclusions, and we're going to assess our information sufficiency. So, we're going to think about what we've gathered so far and figure out what do we need more information for. And I think everyone has given really great comments about the part for what do we need more information for. So one thing that we want to think about is while 100%, we're looking at this statement here, while 100% of coffee is grown in the coffee belt, 99.9% of all coffee we drink is roasted in Europe or America. Coffee is exported out of the coffee belt as raw green bean, and so most of the jobs, income, and profits from coffee are exported out of the coffee belt. So we also have a list of the world's 20 biggest coffee drinkers in kilogram per capita per year. So we have our biggest coffee drinking countries. Here we see this list. And then for each of the following statements, we want to, so we're going to look at each one of these. So for each of the following statements that we see, we're going to choose A, B, C, or D. And let me scroll down without showing the answer. Okay. So for each of the following statements, we're going to have 4 statements. We want to state whether we have A, sufficient information to support, B, initial but not sufficient information to support, C, no information to support, D, initial but not sufficient information to refute, or E, sufficient information to refute, which is just to reject. So we want to look at 4 separate statements. So let's think about statement number 1 first. Ethiopia has substantial room for growth in its coffee industry. So I'm not sure how, if this is set up in polls and answers or how we want to do this. Maybe we could go by the first statement and just have that, and whether you think it's A through E. And then statement number 2, maybe we can go statement by statement. I don't know if that's the best. Yeah, perfect. So this is already set up in polls and answers. So yeah, let's go ahead and look in polls and answers. And for each one of these, you can go ahead. Well, I'll read all of them and we can go ahead and think about all of them for now. So Ethiopia has substantial room for growth in its coffee industry. We can think about, do we have enough information, sufficient information to go based off of, when we think about, let's think about the definition for sufficient again. That means that only based off of the information we have, that is enough to make the conclusion that Ethiopia has substantial room for growth in its coffee industry. The information alone that we have is enough to give us that conclusion. For number 2, or do we, it's initial but not enough to state that conclusion. Do we have no information? Do we have information to maybe say the opposite, to reject that statement? So thinking about those things. Number 2, Vietnam has maxed out the size of its coffee industry. So do we have information to say that Vietnam has actually maxed out the size, its capacity? 3, Brazil's coffee production will remain a world leader for another century. So do we have information to say that Brazil will remain the top coffee producer for another 100 years? And number 4, Ethiopia should fix its trade relations with Germany, a major coffee importer interested in Ethiopian beans. Do we have information to support this or to reject this, or initial information but not enough? So let's think about these questions, and let's think about now based off of what we have done so far in this case, our data that we have seen, what can we say about these statements? Okay, so let's talk about number 1 first while you're thinking about the others and thinking about your answers. So number 1, it looks like the most popular answer is B. So there are about 400 answers for B. That is definitely our clear winner. And that is correct, that we do have, let's scroll and look at the first one. There you go. So B, we have initial but not sufficient information to support it. So that they have substantial room for growth in their coffee industry. And so this is where a lot of you brought up really great points about other things you would have to take into consideration for whether or not they actually have that room for growth. Can they, devote more of that land? Is it worthwhile for them to devote more of that land to coffee? Can they actually export it? Do they have the infrastructure set up to actually export that coffee? There are a lot of factors that you all mentioned that are really great to think about. So we have some initial information that says, yeah, they have the land. They could definitely go ahead and follow Vietnam's path in terms of increasing their coffee, and that could potentially lead to the greater gains that Vietnam saw. But we don't necessarily have information to say that for sure. For number 2, let's discuss that. Vietnam has maxed out the size of its coffee industry. So for that, it looks like our most popular answer is A, sufficient information to support. So actually, for number 2, we have no information to support that. So for number 2, the correct answer is actually C. So we don't know anything about, we did actually see that Vietnam they still have arable land. While we've seen that they have increased, we don't actually have information to know whether or not they've maxed out the size of their coffee industry. They could potentially continue to grow. We don't really know anything about Vietnam and how their trajectory looks in the future. And then for number 3, Brazil's coffee production will remain a world leader for another century. And it looks like our most popular answer for that is C, followed by B. So for number 3, we have for number 3, that is D. We have initial but not sufficient information to refute this. So let's actually look at the answers for these, and then we'll discuss each of them. So, and then our last one, Ethiopia should fix its trade relations with Germany. I think this will be, this one looks like a quick one that everyone knew the answer for was C. So let's go ahead and discuss our number 3. So for Brazil's coffee production will remain a world leader for another century. So, the correct answer here is that we have initial but not sufficient information to refute this. So, there is that we have seen other countries. We saw our regions in our pie graph showing that there are other countries that are actually coming up. We don't actually know, and from our bar graph. So, I personally, I think I would think that this is C. And I don't know if we know anything about whether or not they're going to remain a world leader for another century. But you could say that we may have initial information to refute this because we have seen that there are other countries that are rising, or in terms of trying to increase their coffee production. So yeah, I think number 3 is actually a tricky one that would need some thought. And personally, I kind of think we don't really have the information for that. But you could hypothesize that it could be other countries are increasing their production. It could be that we saw that Brazil was decreasing the amount of land that they were actually devoting to coffee and just trying to increase yield. So it could be that that's not really a priority for them. Maybe they're going to start devoting other land to other crops, things like that. So I would say number 3 is the trickiest one. So for each statement in the previous exercise where you determined you did not have sufficient evidence, can you think of additional studies and data sets you would want to analyze to be confident in your conclusions? Let's see. Yeah, so this is kind of open-ended. I know I'm running a little bit over time here. So I think this one is kind of an open-ended question before we move on. And I can also show 7.2 because we're almost done. But let's think first before we move on to 7.2. We'll spend just a little bit of time discussing what we think we could do, additional data sets. And actually, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time because I think a lot of people already in our live chat have discussed quite a few other things, where we had talked about the other caveats in Ethiopia for growing different kinds of coffee. We would need data sets in terms of their climate predictions. We've discussed a lot of different things. So if everyone's okay with kind of going on to 7.2 for the sake of time, I think we've discussed quite a bit about confounding variables and other evidence that we would need. So let's think about this. Kind of connects actually. Our analysis has determined that Ethiopia has substantial room for growth in its coffee industry and could increase its export quantity for coffee by devoting more of its land to crop production, specifically coffee. Which of the following data sets or studies would be most important for you to study next in order to gain more confidence in this recommendation? So remember, let's put this answer in polls and answers. Is it A, a simulation of Ethiopia's coffee production quantity over the next 2 decades based on models for increases in land usage and coffee yield? B, a table of coffee imports over time for each country in order to identify which countries would be the best targets for Ethiopia to export to? C, a simulation of the other top coffee producers' coffee quantities produced over the next 2 decades in order to assess how crowded the coffee production market will get? Or D, all of the above would be useful and important data sets to have. So in polls and answers, let's go ahead and think about our policy recommendation. If we had known that there's substantial room for growth, what would help us to gain more confidence in that? Okay, I'm not going to give a whole lot of time. We can discuss. It looks like so far the most popular answer is D, which is correct. And this goes to a lot of the things that you've already talked about that we spent some time on earlier, all those different data sets that you might need to say that they have that room for growth. So a simulation of Ethiopia's coffee production quantity would be helpful. A table of coffee imports over time for each country to identify which would be the best targets to export. And we also want to know if there's room in the market for Ethiopia to even expand. We see these other countries like Vietnam really making a play to increase their coffee production. Is there room in the market for Ethiopia to go ahead and try to do the same? So I know we went a little bit fast through the end, and we are a couple minutes over time. So we are wrapping up, and we have kind of our conclusions. I just want to say kind of our main conclusion, and you can read through this on your own, while you're taking your break or later on. That our conclusion here is that our kind of initial conclusion is that Ethiopia has room to expand if they can devote more land. They could potentially follow Vietnam's path in terms of increasing their coffee production and therefore maybe making more making more money from the coffee that they produce. And we saw Brazil and Ethiopia weren't necessarily comparable, but I think the biggest takeaway here is that from our initial exploratory data analysis, we have so many avenues now that we would want to pursue extra data. And you can kind of see how we talked about that one thing, our data from here, our initial conclusions can lead us into some kind of natural next steps for our study. And I hope that, that makes sense to you, what you saw here and the way that we thought about this case, because that's absolutely the way that you should think about your own exploratory data analysis. Is when you find that conclusion, think about, okay, what could have caused this? And what other data now do I need to make my conclusion more solid, to take my initial speculations and make them more solid, to continue to explore them. So I went about 5 minutes over. So we will take a break now for about 10 minutes. I think we're planned to come back at 11:15. So let me stop sharing.